Good morning. It's nice to be here. I was really happy when Chris asked me to preach today because I just love the vitality and the community sense of this congregation. So it's always fun to come back. And there are lots of faces I know and new faces, as there should be, which says you're growing. And I did want to say, since Chris is at General Assembly, I think he has a pretty important role playing there. So keep him in your prayers and General Assembly as we go through the Sunday. And also in the narthex, there is a declaration of when you join the More Light Network, and there are two sermons, one by Jim and one by me on gay marriage from way back when, if anybody is interested in that kind of history. So Chris asked if I would focus a bit on Pride Sunday, which is wonderful. So yes, so please pray with me. God, we ask as we come together today to reflect and pray and sing that you would give us wisdom and courage and love to follow you. Amen. So about the sermon title, I have always wanted to use that Yogi Berra thing in a sermon. Just so weird, but appropriate maybe for today. Because in the last 20 to 30 years, rights for GLBTQIA+ folks have made headway. But looking at what's happening today in our country, we can't be complacent. Those rights can be overturned with the flourish of a pen or a Supreme Court decision. In fact, the ACLU is now tracking 530 anti-gay bills across U.S. state legislatures. So yes, in that rather inelegant phrase of Yogi Berra, deja vu all over again. I thought I would give a little bit of a wee history on Southminster in terms of becoming a more light church. So for those of you who've been here for a long time, this will be just a little romp down memory lane, and raise your hand when you get to something that you remember being here for. And if you're new, maybe it will help put things in context a bit. So it began when Jim Peterson was pastor here. He was motivated by a friend who was a closeted gay minister who talked with him about what that was like. And Jim then led the congregation on a process of discernment. How should Southminster think about gay and lesbian persons for ordination as ministers, elders, and deacons? So Jim led the whole congregation in this process of prayer and study, the Bible, Presbyterian history and polity, etc. How many of you were here for that? Lots, okay. And then in 1993, the session made the decision that one's sexual orientation should not be a hindrance to service as elders or deacons. And while this action was in conflict with the Book of Order, it expressed the deeply held values and conscience of the session and the majority of the congregation. So anybody here that was on that session? Couple? Great. In 1995, the session voted to join the More Light Network. That's the network of Presbyterian churches throughout the U.S. committed to full inclusion of people of all orientations. And actually, Southminster was the first church in the presbytery to join. So perhaps you were here then. And then later, Southminster initiated the overture, which eventually went to General Assembly and led to a change in the Book of Order. Some of you were part of that. In June of 2014, the 221st General Assembly made national headlines when they changed the constitution of the church to include same-sex couples as valid marriages. So I don't know if you remember all that. That was quite amazing when it finally passed. I remember we were all, wow. So while the more like designation was a statement impacting life within the church, it also provided guidance in ways we should act outside the church walls. And in the secular culture at that time, if you remember, there was a lot of conflict over employment, housing, and particularly marriage rights for gay and lesbian citizens. And then later concerns broadened to include transgender rights in terms of medical care and options, and concerns of non-binary individuals. So Southminster was involved in advocating for rights on a number of those issues, most notably the same-sex marriage, which was perhaps the most divisive in the state of Oregon at that time. So if you remember, there was this little 6-week opening when gay and lesbian couples could get licenses and get married, and with the knowledge of the session, I officiated at a number of those marriages. But then came the backlash with the Oregon ballot measure 36, which said a marriage could only be one man and one woman. So we worked with Basic Rights Oregon, Community of Welcoming Congregations, to work for marriage rights. So very long story short, in 2014, same-sex marriage was legalized in Oregon, and then in 2015, it was legalized nationwide with that Supreme Court ruling in the case of Oberfell and Hodges, but it was only a 5-4 decision that the court ruled the 14th Amendment guarantees same-sex couples the fundamental right to marry and required all 50 states to perform and recognize such marriages. But marriage certainly was not the only area of inequity. Legal protection for gay and lesbian, transgender, and non-binary individuals in the United States is a hodgepodge, depending on the state you live in. While transgender employees are federally protected from workplace discrimination, there's no comprehensive anti-discrimination law concerning housing or public spaces, and many states restrict gender-affirming health care and identity documents. Transgender individuals are currently barred from enlisting in the U.S. military following an executive order of our current president, and access to health care for trans and non-binary people is especially a concern, especially for young people. So over half of the U.S. states have passed laws or enacted executive orders that restrict or ban gender-affirming care for minors, even if the parents request it. Oregon was the first state in the U.S. to legally recognize non-binary identities and continues to offer robust legal protections. But it's not true on the federal level. For example, new U.S. passports are currently restricted to either male or female designation, reflecting on an applicant's biological sex assigned at birth, which follows an executive order again in November of 2025. So anyway, this, I think, might sound all very abstract and legalese, and we're a church. We're not a legal aid society. But as a church, we're committed to love our neighbor as ourself, to enabling all people to see the beauty and the divine within themselves. So denying basic rights solely on orientation or gender identity erodes the humanity of people. And it says, you're not acceptable, you're not good enough. And like the kids, it's like, oh, what is wrong with us then? When we allow the humanness of anyone to be diminished, it diminishes all of us. For we are one body spiritually. And there are real-world consequences. For example, the passport issue. Now, how many of you travel internationally? There you go. So the worst thing would be, you don't want to get stopped going in or out of a country, right? Because you have the wrong passport information. So think of what could happen if your passport identity no longer corresponds to the identity you are living. That would not be fun. Think about what happens if you're transitioning and your insurance will no longer cover medicine or surgical care that you need. Imagine that your child cannot receive the gender-affirming care that is needed. Depression and suicide rates are disproportionately higher for non-binary, transgender, and gay and lesbian youth than for other youth. But it's not because of who they are. It's because of society and family responses to who they are. I remember a few years ago with the Washington County Human Rights Council, we were doing listening sessions with the gay and lesbian groups at a high school here. And we were listening to, as they talked about their fears and their worries, and they described being targets of bullying and being misunderstood or dismissed by other students and sometimes by teachers. But the most chilling response was when I said to them, "Where is it that you feel most unsafe?" Do you know what they said? At home. That was the most chilling thing I've heard, because they were afraid if their parents even had a suspicion they might be gay or lesbian or trans, they'd be thrown out of the house. Or they would be sent off to one of those counseling sessions that's supposed to make you be different. I'm afraid institutionalized religion bears a huge responsibility for that. For having taught over decades that the only way to be was straight, and that's what the Bible said, which is actually not true, but so I know there are congregations like Southminster where people can feel safe, but there's a whole lot of young people out there who don't have a place that really can be safe. And little things can be big things. One of the students said to me, they were having a really bad time, really being depressed, and drove by this church and saw the All Are Welcome banner, the rainbow banner, and that was the one we had way before that Judy Tidrick had designed. And that for that person, it was a sign that, well, maybe they weren't so awful and sinful. And if they could just hang on until they could leave home, maybe they'd be okay. I also heard from another student who said she lied on Sundays to go to church here because her parents would have locked her in her room if they knew she was going to a church that was supportive of gays and lesbians. And I have to say, that's the only time I've ever heard a kid say they lied to go to church. I've heard lots of them say they lie to get out of going to church. So there are things that, are really important that we can do. There was another young adult who said she was coming to a class here on the Bible and homosexuality, we called it years ago. But she was so scared, she sat in her car in the parking lot for half an hour because her family had told her this was where Satan was, and if she came in here, she would be damned. So these are situations religions have direct responsibility for causing. So we also have responsibility for changing. And small things like that banner might make a big difference to a young person or an older person who's having trouble. Using pronouns that non-binary people request can make a big difference. Research shows that transgender and non-binary youth who were able to change their name or their gender marker on legal documents and who had access to spaces that affirmed their orientation had a much lower suicide rate. Respecting a person's pronouns is one way to provide that sense of safety for some people. And I know for us older people, me included, it's really hard to get our mind around that, because we all learned this grammar thing about singular nouns and singular pronouns, and it's hard to, but it makes a difference, so we can try. People sometimes say to me, so what would Jesus say about same-sex marriage or rights for gay, lesbian people? Well, I don't know. I mean, that wasn't even a thing when Jesus was alive. There was no social scientific construct. But if we look at his teaching in general and the way he lived, it all goes to one very basic concept. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And then I hear sometimes from people, well, this is just one of these trendy things. It's a matter of people being woke, I never understood what that was so bad about being woke. But anyway, I guess you're supposed to be asleep or something. But it's not. It's actually following a very traditional gospel understanding. The commandment of Jesus to love your neighbor. So I think Southminster can be very proud of its history and inclusion of all orientations. And we should definitely celebrate with Beaverton on Pride Weekend. And we can't be complacent. We know there are many places, even in Oregon, where people do not feel safe and they're bullied and teased and even worse. So yes, it is deja vu, all over again. And it's really frightening and it's outrageous that we have to go through these same struggles all the time. But I think we shouldn't feel too sorry for ourselves because in our history, there have always been times of darkness, dark ages, and enlightenment. And we just have to learn to work together and go through this more, whatever is needed to make sure people's rights are going to be given to them. So there are lots of things we can do, and I mentioned a few. Support groups like Basic Rights Oregon. Make sure that the church keeps flying that banner out there. If you hear people in conversation denigrating gay and lesbian people, speak up, Those are simple things because some of us are old and we can't go to rallies and protest so easily anymore, but we can do those sorts of things. Because as a faith community, we are called to carry the promise of hope and love within us, even more importantly in the times of darkness than in the times of progress. Most of all, we carry within our communities the assurance that, as Isaiah says, we are precious in God's sight and honored and loved. And this is why we continue to work for justice and equality. So never let anyone convince you or anyone else that you are anything less than beautiful. And never forget that your loving is a miracle. May it be so. And you can probably join in with Kathy singing that if you wish.
And one more time.